Welcome back to YellowCard Vanguard channel. It is both Toku and Zystral here to give you guys something special, and that is a more in-depth commentary between ourselves playing something that we want to call the echelon of VPremium format, and that is Steam Maidens, the Terror, and Glendios, which seems to be the strongest anti-meta into the Steam Maidens matchup. What's your thoughts on this matchup right now?
The point of this series is going to be a look at the metagame for various formats. Hopefully we'll do one for standard, one for premium, but for now we're focusing on V, and it's trying to break down and digest the metagame, as it were. When you go to a BCS, what decks have you been seeing a lot of? What decks do you expect to see? And we're basically just digesting and breaking down the matchups, lines of play, options, so on and so forth. So to speak specifically about this matchup, as you said, right now we're in a position where, as of time of recording, Steam Maiden is the tier 0 best deck in VPremium by a long shot, but it's not the unbeatable deck. So, as we saw in a recent BCS past, Glendios actually came first place, beating out 3 other Steam Maidens in the top cut, and that's because the way Glendios works as a deck is almost perfect for countering Steam Maidens, which hopefully we'll see here today, just to show you that even though Steam Maiden is the best deck tier 0, it's not unbeatable.
So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. In this round, actually, Zystral ends up going first, riding into Warlight Dragon, and does get the filter for 2. One of the main things here that I do is, as a Steam Maiden player, because I have a lot of inherent plussing engine, calling down the Gear Cat early because it is a ±0 if I am able to hit and get a +1 off of it. I can also attack, and then it provides some pseudo shield on the board.
Yeah, which is especially relevant because one of the things about Steam Maiden in the early game is that both Steam Maiden and Glendios have very solid forms of plussing and filtering, but they don't really interact with each other. Specifically on this turn 2, I really don't have a reliable way of locking that cat and keeping it locked, so it being on the board is just not going to be something that I'm going to attack into in order to deny you counterblast for the Entrana play.
So you also see that I actually opted to throw my Quick Shield at the Vanguard swing because the Quick Shield is just a 5k shield that really does not do anything else in the later stages of the game, so I may as well try and get that cat to get another attack out. Maybe even on this turn have it be able to boost the Nabu that I am able to cycle into the soul here. And that's one of the main things here, is that at this early stage of the game, because Glendios as a deck plays a lot of grade 3s naturally for all the reverse units, their hand is weak in the early game, so I'm trying to take advantage of that and try and really push on the pressure.
Yeah, especially because I don't have a Palladium on the board yet, so those grade 3 reverses don't have any shield at all. But you're playing really aggro here, which also helps to quote-unquote counter Glendios in a way, because I'm going to be further away from 5, or as I get closer to 5, you get closer to World End, but at the same time it's harder for me to get defensives, which means that I'll have to defend a lot more aggressively as turns go by.
Yeah, it kind of all triples up. You're harder to get defensives, as I am like a multi-attack deck, and defensives really does help soften the bleeding of the hand. But also that, as you're always on the higher stage of the level with me, if I do end up hitting you to 5, and we do end up to that endgame nitty-gritty part where World End is a possibility, you always have that chance of healing out of World End via damage triggers or via drive checks.
Yeah, so here the G assist for you doesn't actually hurt that much, mainly because the Steam Maiden plussing engine is so unconditional. Pretty much everything on the board, anything that you can cool down can refund itself in some way, shape or form, whereas most of my plussing either costs counterblast or is in the form of on hits like with Craving Claw. So even though I'm still advantaged here, the fact that I've gone first in your G-assisting, I'm still fighting that uphill battle of not giving you too much room to play with. The thing I want to talk about is the fact that you have this, when I cool down the Zirconium, you lock to the front row. And this is pretty relevant, mainly because by reducing the Zirconium from gaining power, it stops becoming a threat to get the on-hit in the early game, which then makes it easier for you to get that grinding resource game plan that you're looking to get. And the other benefit is that Steam Maiden only needs one front row open circle to actually start doing its combo, so locking one circle in the front row doesn't really make a difference as long as you can keep the other front row empty at the end of your turn.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's one of the main things that I was thinking of, because everybody knows Steam Maidens, they combo off of one column. If they have that extra column to jump back into the other column, that's just bonus, but with one column and 2 counterblasts, you're getting a 5 use out of that force marker. So locking that unit into the front row circle not only negs you one hand, but it debuffs your Zirconium, making it easier for me to guard that column. and thus I'm able to grind out, just like you said, the resources. One of the cool things I want to point out about this play here is that I was gonna jump the Ururu into the gear cat that I had set up the turn prior, and instead of calling it to the circle to attack once again, for fear of it getting locked onto that circle that I had just a force marker on, I put it right behind our Vanguard, so this gets it out of the way of that entire column, and make sure that should the time come where I need to combo onto that column again, it's available.
Yeah, the important thing here is that because the unit that Zirconium Blast Turn has unlocked, that now gives me a target for my reverses, and I'm always going to lock your front row to reduce your offensive pressure, which means that Gear Cat in the back row, if I don't use that Craven Claw there, becomes safe, which means it can either keep boosting for more pressure, or if I do use my Craven Claw, which I ended up doing, that's then one less thing you have to worry about, and it's already done its job of plussing 1.
I think this is one of the more interesting boards that you presented against me as well, is the double Craven Claw on the rearguard columns, and then no Craven Claw on the Vanguard circle. But the Vanguard circle was also the easiest for me to guard, and so I actually ended up taking it here because I did want some damage to eventually start playing the game. So I ended up taking the damage here, and then I was planning on guarding the other two. Luckily, as we saw from my G-Assist, I did have a bunch of Grade 4 Ulurus in hand, which I believe was able to 1-card guard this column, and then 2-card guard the next column, but I could be mistaken.
Yeah, the only thing to be aware of is that, as we've said, you want to be leaving your front row open so that you can continue to aggro and combo me during your turns without any hindrance. And aggressively binding with Uluru can get into a position where you will have to call something off of the quote-unquote time leap effects, because those are not optional. You know, if you have a legal call target, you have to call them. And one line of play that we discussed up until this point is that you can potentially, set your bind zone up in a way that leaves you with no 2s in your bind zone, so that when your grade 1 attacks, you can leap it into nothing and leave your front row open.
Yeah, so this turn, as we're going into right here, was one of the slower turns I had to take because, just like Zystral had said, the way to play as Steamated into Glendios is to actually try and whiff your time leaps. Maybe go from 0, 1, 2, and then your 2 will whiff into the 3. But the problem is I had just bound the grade 3 Heal Guardian, which makes it a legal trigger for either my Entriana to jump into or for my Olu to jump into. So I was trying to finagle a way to whiff a jump to keep that rows open. So what I ended up doing was, in order to make sure I always had an open circle, I would call the Entriana and call the cat over, then call the cat over the cat here, and just basically, at the same time I'm filtering my deck, I'm basically filling up my drop zone as well, just in case I need more bind targets. And trying to just make a bunch of legal bind targets here. So once again, I do the same play that I did last turn. I call the grade 0 over the cat, pushing the cat into the bind zone. So I can go grade 0, jump into the cat. And I think here I even call the cat behind the locked card in the rear circle, just to make sure, once again, I do end up with open rearguard circle with that force marker.
Yep, and here, as we said, now that I have the Palladium on board, all of my grade 3s become shield. So when it comes to raw defensive power, I definitely have the advantage there. The downside is that I don't have nearly as much plussing, as you can see, from how stacked your hand is versus how stacked my hand is. So every time I have to guard, it's more work for me than it is for you. And the point is that, I even though I have win cons that don't involve dealing damage, your win con is still dealing damage, but because of that, it's easier for you to get to your win con than it is for me to get to mine.
Absolutely. So, and I think the thing is that eventually you do run out of reverses. Like, the deck does run a lot of reverses, but eventually you will start to dwindle down on shield power. And between Magnet Hollow, between Zirconium, you do counterblast a lot, and if I recall correctly, Glendios lists don't usually run a form of countercharge. So your countercharge is falling into my game plan, and that is taking damage. So a lot of this matchup is basically each other trying to dance around hoops to try and avoid each other's game plan. So at this turn here, I think I'm happy to try and guard everything because I've got the 3 counterblasts needed to full combo on Steam Maidens. Everything here is guardable. The Vanguard column was easily guardable because there was no force marker on it. There's no reason for me to take a damage that I could have guarded and then kind of lose out on hand value because everything else in the future becomes harder to guard.
Yeah, so we'll take a quick pause here because something I want to discuss, some theory I want to discuss about Steam Maiden in general is the idea of 3 damage. A lot of people say oh, you should damage my Steam Maiden early so that they can't use Entrana. which is one magic number for damage, 0, but the other magic number of damage for Steam Maiden is 3. And this is because a full combo turn of double leaping both columns costs exactly 3 counterblast, which means that if you hit Steam Maiden to 3 and leave them on 3, when they go from, if they start the chain from 0 and going up all the way up to 3, they won't have the counter charge from jumping from 0 to 1 again. And even if they do, they'll spend that counter charge, the counterblast, on going back from 1 to 2 on the other side. So specifically, let's say on the left, you'll go from 1 to 2, that's one counterblast. 2 to 3, that's a second counterblast. Then on the other side, you'll go from 0 to 1, which is a counter charge. Then from 1 to 2 for a counterblast, and then 2 to 3 for a counterblast. So that leaves you with no counterblast open at the end of the turn, which means that if you want to combo again next turn, you either need to take some damage, which then involves you risking crits from the Vanguard swing, or you'll have to have another grade 0 Uluru in hand to call down already, or have a way to call it from bind to be able to restart the counter charge and get one attack there again.
So on off footage that we weren't able to record due to processing issues, there actually was a game where I went first and Zystral actually slammed down 3 Craven Claws against me. So that's another good example of 0 or 3. So by giving them 0 damage, yeah, you don't give them the Entriana, but by giving them the 3 damage, not only are you plussing off of your on-hit skills, or if you're like the best things you usually rush a Steam Maiden with are like with these on-hits. You either force them into the issue of do I take the damage so I can Entriana, and then risk not having defensive and I'm forced to lose hand on the other on-hit skill, or do I guard everything, prevent the on-hits, but then I'm not able to access Entriana, and now I'm dealing with on-hits on the next turn right after. So that is actually something that happened on a prior game that we played, that I ended up taking 1 and guarding 2. And unfortunately for me, what happened was I actually didn't have Entriana, so what I should have done was probably just guarded everything. And I think that's another thing to talk about too, is that if you do give them the 3 damage and they only have the 1 Entriana, that 2 damage that they have now face up if they can't find another Entriana off of the cat rots. So basically they've taken damage that they didn't have to, and then as we get into the later stages of the game, that's less damage buffer they have for defensives as you're going for your lethal turns.
Yeah, the only thing you're really afraid of at that point is if they somehow high roll and have like full 0 to 3 leap combo on turn 3, which is very rare, or double or triple Entrana, which is also very rare. But the thing to be aware of when you're playing against Steam Maiden is that the Steam Maiden player knows whether or not they have Entranas in hand or whether they have full combo in hand, and so they will generally be able to control how much damage they're taking. So if they're taking a bunch of damage and giving you a bunch of on-hits, that means that they're probably going to hit you back with a bunch of Entranas next turn, which is something to be keep in mind. So based on the discussion we just had, we can see here that in the bind zone, you're pretty much set up to go from 0 to 3. All you're missing is a 2, I believe.
Yes.
And which you can easily put in with Elo.
And that's something I can easily put in with Elo as well, but that's also something I did intentionally, was to miss a 2. Because if I commit too early and I'm unable to kill, then I basically set myself up for a loss. So once again, what I do here is because I know I do have a cat in my deck, I go ahead and do the same play that I did last time. I call the Entriana, I bind the Entriana from drop zone, call it out of bind, and call the cat over, making sure to always have it in drop. And basically my goal here is to ensure that I never have a grade 2 in my bind zone during this turn. As you can see, I once again call over, and that's something that people tend to kind of forget, is that because they're so focused on plussing with Steam Maidens, the deck that's just naturally plusses so hard, they tend to not call over when against some certain matchups, like in Chaos in Link Jokers, and especially in Glendios, calling over is what you have to do in order to keep the open circles. Because Ben now has a damage buffer for 2 more counterblasts, and I have 2 open circles. So at the same time that I'm trying to push him to later, he also doesn't want to take too much damage, because most I'll give him is 1 more damage. That way I'll never fall into the possibility of World End. With only 1 more damage, his Zirconium can only ever call to 1 open circle, being the one behind the force mark.
Yeah, the important thing as well here is that if you leap into a grade 3, none of the grade 3s can remove themselves from the board after battle, which gives me a front row target to lock with the Glendios' on reverse place. And the moment I lock both of your front row circles, the game basically ends, which is the concern there. So by using the Nabu, which goes into Soul instead of leaping, or by because you weren't able to prevent a grade 2 from going to your bind zone, the best you can do is avoid 2s, and then you can maybe combo from 0 to 1 and then fail there, and that's still some attacks that you would have gotten otherwise.
Absolutely. What I would have loved to do on this turn would be able to go from 0, 1 with, and I think I actually do that in the next upcoming turn, but slowly, turn after turn, because I'm able to always just swing Vanguard, have one attack on the force marker that forces an extra card out of hand. We are able to slowly whittle down your hand until I feel that it's possible to go for game. And then through that, I think I'm able to basically just like grind out the resources, because I've been able to deny these Craven Claws on hits turn after turn after turn. I think I eventually do let one go through just to be able to get that extra counterblast, or just because my hand wasn't really in a good guarding value for the double triggers that you got that turn, as well as with how big Magnet Hollow gets in the late game.
Yeah, there is a discussion here as well, which is the use of Force 1 or Force 2. Some people could say that if you expect them to lock both of your front rows because you chased full combo and weren't able to leave a front row circle open, maybe it's worth going Force 2 on Vanguard just so that they can never afford to no guard at 4, which then means that you're safe from World End at all times. What do you think about that possibility?
So that's something I actually ended up doing against you in like the prior games. I went Force 2, and I heavily tutored for the Innervate Dragon just to make my bind zone really big. And thus I'd have this really large PG or die Vanguard swing. And I think when I did it, I kind of went too gung-ho on it. I like what you said, where like Force 2 becomes a good option once both of your front rows are locked. And I think in that kind of sense, Force 2 would be good going second. And if you were given a lot of counterblast, then you could have your Entrianas on both sides. And then as your front row gets locked, then you go Force 2 on the center, and that's how you just jam the game going forward. But at the same time, you also want to be able to do some multi-attack on the left column. So I went Force 2 because being able to lock the player at 4 damage, not give them the chance of World End, and also because it is pretty much a PG check with how early aggression Steam Maidens can get as well. You can push them to 3 or 4 early, in which case that Force 2 can really get really heinous.
Yeah, and what's relevant here is now, by lining up your attack order in such a way that your attacks can always have crit pressure, I'm at 4, but I can't just take this to get to World End. Like the more attacks I'm having to guard, the more dangerous it is for you.
Mm-hmm.
So here again, by whiffing at 2, you've left your front row open with 2 force markers, and I'm on 4, so I can only take 1 more attack, and I definitely can never take the Vanguard attacks. So at this point, I have to just go, well, I have to hope that a bunch of your rearguard attacks have no crit and get to World End that way.
Yeah. So getting that second force marker onto the Magnet Hollow here. So my hand is surprisingly still healthy despite not having the Entriana, and that's basically just because every turn that I'm able to, Elo is technically a +1. You're able to reanimate something from bind, and I'm just able to keep guarding the Vanguard swings, hard guarding the on-hit pressure, and I think on this upcoming turn, I'm also able to like start really eating at that hand through the use of Colossus.
Yeah, the fact that you can put stuff onto the board for free is what really makes or breaks this matchup, because even though we're putting forward equal amounts of offensive pressure, it's costing me a card every turn where it's costing you nothing, and that's what really... That combined with the Colossus guard restrict is what really breaks open this matchup, I think.
Yeah.
Is the make or break point.
Yeah.
Like, again, all it takes is for you to make one tiny mistake and either attack with a rearguard that doesn't have crit first, or give me that 5th damage, or leave a body on the board, and then I just find the Zirconium and get to World End.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as we don't get to that point, then you are mostly safe.
Yeah. So a lot of the game is basically trying to dance around locks, but also dance around your own mandatory jump restriction. So it is at this point that I actually chose to put the grade 2 into the bind zone, because I figured, okay, this might be time for me to try and do something here. I swing with a 0 to get the counter charge. This forces the double intercept.
Yeah, the risk with going for the full combo from 0 to 3 here is that because you have to attack with your rear guards first, so like at least once,
yeah,
it gives me that chance to get to the 5th damage. And not like we said earlier, none of the grade 3s remove themselves from the board. So here I'm taking that 5th damage, and I do heal down, which is good for you, because now you can attack with Vanguard with the crit pressure. But if I hadn't healed there, I would have been on 5, and that would have been, again, World End pressure for you.
Yeah.
Which means I just need to find one more body to lock the rearguard in the front row, and then find one more Zirconium to lock the back row, and then the game ends.
Yeah.
So the risk you're taking here is that I go to 5 but cannot guard everything, and I don't have a Zirconium.
Yeah. So that was pretty much the risk I was taking there, and then like you being able to double intercept as well was like good hindsight, because if you just like double maybe like, because most people like when they think of, oh, Colossus is coming in the future, I may as well make use of the cards in hand now, would have like guarded from hand there. But by you double intercepting at that point, it cuts out the venue of me attacking into rear guards to be able to get the drive 2, that is the +2, and then being able to attack into the other rear guard with my rear guard and just try to pick at pieces until I know I can kind of go for lethal here.
Yeah, I think it's definitely all about patience from the Steam Maiden player, in that you're going to spend a lot of turns with incomplete combos and with very lukewarm, like +1, +2 turns with not a lot of pressure, just so you can keep your bind low enough that you don't end up accidentally leaving yourself open to losing. But then you can get into a position where here the crit pressure comes through and the game ends.
Yeah. So eventually, yeah, the game eventually broke down into what I like to call like the game. There comes a point where you're playing against Glendios and the game comes down to they no guard when they're on 4, and you crit and you win, or you don't and you face world end. Because at this point, because of how much binding that I've done, there's no way for me to keep my front row empty anymore. So at this point I had figured it was time to go. Ideally, if you do have the resources to pop the Nabu out of Soul, like for instance, there's a few ways that you can Soul Blast. One of them is Kurunta, which I do not play. The other one is Innervate Dragon, which I wasn't able to find this game, or I think I dumped it out for Colossus in favor of Colossus using Lost Dog 8. But basically being able to pop Nabu out of Soul, pop it into the bind, and then go from 0-1 Nabu. If you can keep doing that as a cycle, you get really good pacing against Glendios, because you're able to combo off that force marker and the Glendios player still has to deal with it, and then they aren't able to lock the Nabu or whatever comes out onto that force marker to end your turn. But also being able to ensure you have that open force marker, you always have 4 other circles that you're going to lock onto from Zirconium.
Yeah, like in this situation here, you hitting the crit was, good for you, like it was the game-winning play, but I pretty much had to no guard, because if I guard it and you put a crit onto the Colossus, that column becomes a little bit harder to guard because of the double force marker. But at the same time, if I either heal out of that or you don't hit the crit, by leaving that Colossus in the front row, I have the Zirconium in hand, I have one more reverse in hand, the game literally does end on the spot.
Yeah. But at the same time, if I didn't get the crit on that point, then the venue of play opens that I pass turn there. And yes, I don't win on that point, and I don't immediately lose on that point, but without venue of comboing, it becomes harder for me to play now that all my force markers are funneled onto the left side of the board, rather than that force 2 that we see on the center sometimes in those matchups.
Yeah, and the important thing there is that once we get into a position where, even if I'm not on 5 damage and I'm nowhere close to world ending you, because say you have the crit pressure on the Vanguard circle, when you only have 1 attack per turn, but I have a really huge Magnet Hollow coming at you every turn, then I will just win the damage race the old-fashioned way.
And even, yeah, because Magnet Hollow is a card that just scales with time as well, and that as time goes on and every turn cycle, we're able to bind a reverse. Every turn cycle, Magnet Hollow gets bigger by 5k. Eventually, I don't have the cards in hand to guard anymore. And yes, I play the 4 Grade 4 Uluru because it is the largest shield in the game right now. I used them early, so I didn't have them in the later stages of the game. We saw that I actually lost one of my PGs to the Zirconium, so that's another PG that I lost. Eventually, I would run out of resources, whereas Magnet Hollow, because I'm now stuck on only 1 attack per turn. Even if I was to swing into the Magnet Hollow, the hand disparity and then like the attack disparity turns out in the Glendios player's favor.
Yeah, like in this game in particular, we were discussing about damage denying the Entrana, and the reason I attacked at all is because my hand is in quite a dire state, and the risk of you going +3 from the Entrana is worth attacking just to maybe fix my hand. I think, in this, we can't really see it, but I think in this position my hand was like 4 reverses, 2 Glendios, and no triggers, so it was really hard for me to survive this upcoming turn. But the benefit here is that you didn't find the Entrana, but instead you're doing the grade 3 digging for Reinnovate with the Force 2 on Vanguard, trying to stack as many cards in the bind zone as possible, which means this tells me that I need to guard more aggressively in the early stages, while the +3k from Elul doesn't stack too high, so that once Elo gets high enough that I can't guard it without a PG, then I can just no guard and hopefully get to 5 and world end you that way.
This was one of the sillier moments that I did where I forgot to try and make a whiff target. And also the thing is, by going Force 2 on the Vanguard Circle, your combo pieces don't really hit hard anymore. So I am basically relegating my attacks to grade 3s. Because Elo, jumping out of the Elo on the grade 3 rearguard, Elo on the Vanguard Circle does get significantly large enough with how much I bind. But as you see here, my initial thought was I was going to swing with the grade 3 rearguard Elo, but I had completely forgotten that I guarded with the grade 4 Aluru, and that is technically a legal target for me to jump into. So there was no way for me to actually empty my board as I had hoped, because I was hoping to be able to actually do 2 Force 2 markers on rearguard and Vanguard Circle at this point, but slight lapse of judgment, and then I really do choke myself out of a lot of the game.
Yeah, so we see here the forced grade 4 leap coming into play, which means it is going to be a front row target for me to lock with Glendios during the next turn. And here, you've only got 5, which is a lot for turn 3, but not enough that I can't guard. Yeah. So I -2 crit with the heal guard, and you find one anyway to put me on 3, which is still low enough that I can still afford to no guard one of your upcoming Vanguard swings. And by locking the board down in this way, because you've gone Force 2 on the Vanguard and not Force 1 on the rear guard, even if I leave one of your front row circles open, it's significantly less threat in that next turn.
So we can actually see that like my hand has bled a lot this turn because of all the extra hand commitment I had to do. Just the raw fear of Entreon existing. If you can't hit them to 3, then you shouldn't hit them at all is the main thing to say. So because I didn't have to guard the initial attack, I didn't have to worry about Entreon. So as you see here, the Draconia came down and actually chose to lock in the front row because at this point in the game, I've realized that my only attacker would be the Vanguard. I was going to try and make it as large as possible, and one of the main things I got lucky with is that I don't think there were enough locks this turn to actually lock my Reinnovate Dragon. So I would be able to once again Reinnovate Dragon, fill up my bind a bit more, and hopefully just try and get my Elo to a PG checkpoint.
Yeah, and the other downside here is that I've only just found my Palladium there in the drive checks, so not having a Palladium this turn on your second grade 3 swing means that I'm losing out on a huge amount of shield. But at this point, the amount of damage you have now, because you have no front row, doesn't really make a difference. Like, the moment Glendios comes down, if your front row gets locked, you're never having a front row again.
Yeah.
So my question is, between like Craven Claw on hits and Counterblast 1 searches, can I find enough shield that I can reliably survive Elo until we get to the PG checkpoint?
Yeah. So, once again, with the Reinnovate that I've left on board, I go ahead and pop those 2 into the bind zone. And off the top 3, I do believe I find a cat that I end up using as a booster, just because the cat would be a naturally bigger booster here. So yeah, I actually call the cat over the grade 1 just to make sure I have an open circle. That way, I'm not always going to be locked into World End. I'm basically A, asking for a PG, and B, asking for the second Zirconium to be able to get world ended.
Yeah, the extra 1k from the cat per bind just makes the Elo column even harder to guard, which, arguably, if you hadn't put the cat there, this might not necessarily have been a PG check yet, but the extra, 11 or 12k from the cat does indeed turn to a PG check, which I don't have, and again, I take the damage and don't heal. And that's the main way that Steam Maiden has to play around Glendios, which is, you know that they will world end you at some point. You know that they will stop your attacks at some point. So you just need to get them into a position where they're bleeding enough resources that they can't survive all those death by 1,000 cuts sort of style.
Yeah.
So here we're going to cut to in the middle of another game where the game's gone on for a bit. I've got all the Zirconiums. I've had a bit more plussing, and you've chosen to go Force 2 again. And here, even though you've gone Force 2 onto the Vanguard Circle, we're still playing the game of leave a front row open so that you can do some amount of damage. But now that I have what's basically my full engine online, I will eventually win this damage race just from the fact that I have crit pressure on the Vanguard with the Zirconium in the back row. I've got the Interceptor from the reverses every turn. I've got on-hit pressure from the Craven Claw. And even though you are going for the PG, this Vanguard Swing or Die route, I'm on 3 damage, which means I can afford to no-guard one of your Vanguard swings and get just that little bit closer to the world end.
Yeah. So me not being able to push you to 4 damage in the early games definitely makes it a lot harder, because either I swing Vanguard and I don't get the crit, and that pushes you to 5, and then that puts me on world end check. Or I have to hit for 1 off of a rearguard, which at this point is impossible now that I've chosen to go Force 2. I'm unable to get like the increased incremental power gains. My multi-attack combo is very weak, and because you're able to attack more than once per turn, my multi-attack combo probably does not do too much. I have a few legal targets that are able to swing for over 13, one of them being the Alo. If I'm able to call out a bind and bind another thing, then I have to make sure that when I do swing with her, I have no legal targets in bind to be able to force jump into. Otherwise, you guard that one, you take the Vanguard swing, and then I'm in world break again.
Yep. But even then, looking at how you're guarding here versus how I'm putting forward an defense, it's really worth reminding people that one of the other strengths of Steam Maidens, one of the reasons it's the tier 0 deck of the format, is that every single card you use, every single card you make use of serves double purpose. Everything you guard with can be bound from the drop zone and then called from the bind zone as an attacker. Or, everything you attack with can then go into the bind zone and then set itself up again. Can be reused as an attacker next turn as well. Whereas with Glendios, every piece I have needs to be dug for a certain purpose, right? Cravenclaw is the on hit that maybe generates me soul. Zirconium is what fills up the board. Palladium is what generates me the shield. But then they just sit on the board. Like, nothing I have performs double duty in the way that your cards do.
Yeah.
Other than, like, intercepting with a reverse for 10k. But then the difference is that my searches aren't as specific. I can search for a reverse with the Magnet Hollow, and I have on hit top 5 for a Star Vader with Cravenclaw. But I don't have the amount of filtering and plussing that Steam Maiden has to be able to just get into any single piece it has at any given moment. For example, if I'm looking for the Zirconium, and I don't find Zirconium off of Cravenclaw, but I find like Palladiums and Wildlines, that's useless to me. Whereas your Entrana Soul Blast 1 top 2, it doesn't matter what you add, because it's either a trigger, which is going to be a huge shield, or it's going to be a Steam Maiden, which is going to be part of your combo.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most interesting things is that in a lot of other decks, there are things called dead zones, where your cards will be dead in the drop zone, your cards are dead in the bind zone if you're playing against Narukami. But if you're playing against Steam Maiden, you have no dead zones except for cards in your deck, which, because of how quickly you go through your deck, is also not a dead zone. So I think that's like one, just like to add addendum to your statement that Steam Maidens is why is one of the best decks in the format right now, is because they play on every zone very well. Be it deck, bind, drop, field, and the only other deck that can actually kind of control that is Link Joker, being able to control the field a bit. And as like we're seeing right now, so what I actually ended up doing was I got impatient here. I got impatient, I tried to do the PG check, and unfortunately I just wasn't big enough yet, and Zystral was able to hard guard. So I did the grade 2 jump into the Deer Colossus, bind from hand, and basically did the PG check. Was able to hard guard, and I do still have a lot of ways to increase my bind here. So I do believe I go for another PG check on the next turn after, but Zystral does get the heal here, which then makes my next turn a lot harder. It eventually does come down to check crit and win or get world ended.
Yeah, and like you're saying, this is the game, right? Like, I'm going to be at a point where if you check a crit, you win, and if you don't, you lose. And the heal there is what let me get to that point. Like, if I hadn't checked that heal there, I would still be in a position where I'm having to guard everything every turn.
Yeah.
Which is still... It's not hard, but it's still an uphill battle. Like, the fact that you have 5 lock circles means that you can no longer effectively plus, but because Elul can still bind from the drop zone with no open circles and not call anything, you will still be growing your bind zone every turn, which means that eventually your Vanguard attacks will get bigger than I can guard. Whereas my rearguard attacks will never get to that point outside of Magnet Hollow. But in the end, you attack, I no guard, you don't have the crit, and the game does end.
Yeah. There's no, at this point, there's no need to like play it out because we do get to the world break eventually. So in this game here, I once again go Force 2, except one of the more interesting things here is that I was actually able to get the rewrite, which gets me a Force 2 onto the rearguard circle. So now I have an open rearguard circle, which I am able to combo on with a Force 2. Now, as I stated before, the numbers aren't going to be big, but the fact that it's a base crit already puts a lot of pressure on Zystral's hand. It makes each attack more scary to guard. So here I bind, and basically I kind of just do this like needless bind jumping just to build the bind. And then from hand, I call the Nabu onto the Force 2. So Nabu is good in the sense that I force Ben to guard with only triggers. And funnily enough, in a deck like Glendios, which does play a lot of grade 3s, it becomes very awkward. So unfortunately, I do get the crit on the no guard there, but if I was not to get the crit there, I'd be putting Ben on 5, which now that I have 2 Force 2s, 5 and 4 doesn't really change the story too much, but gives him more chances to heal out. I have the Nabu on the Force 2. If I was to get any triggers to put it on the Nabu, I force a different kind of guarding pattern, because Glendios right now plays the Heal Guardians. It plays a lot of the grade 3s. That's a lot of cards you can't guard with against Nabu. So it's another trigger check, basically. That Nabu does have the garbage check, does have the crit, and it disappears is the main thing.
Yeah, like once you leave that board empty, you've only got 1 locked circle and 4 open circles. I need to find all 4 Zirconiums very quickly in order to get anywhere near World End, to abuse the fact that I'm on 5 damage. Like the thing to remember that when you're playing against Glendios is that they're not going to aggressively be pursuing World End. They're going to be aggressively pursuing the idea of stop you from attacking and then beat you down with 28k or 38k reverse units. Like that's their main game plan, to get you to 6 damage. And if you can stop that from happening because they're on higher damage and they don't have the time to set up the power, that's your basically how you dodge their win con.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of it is like basically it is a game of speed at one point, but then eventually when your opponent does get to Glendios, you need to really stop the brakes before you drive yourself off a cliff. Because in a lot of games that might be what happens here. You get lost in the sauce. You're so happy to like resolve entry on a turn after turn after turn that eventually you have 5 cards on board. That's how you throw away games, yeah.
That's going to be it for what is hopefully episode 1 of our metagame matchup breakdown showcase title pending ? Like I said, we're going to be focusing on VPremium for the time being, and hopefully we'll be able to have another matchup and another breakdown for you with commentary very soon.
In any case, this has been Toku and Zystral from the YellowCard Vanguard channel. I hope you guys enjoyed this, because this is what we're going to be doing for the, hopefully, like Zystral said, the next upcoming bit. We want to like really showcase what is VPremium outside of just Steam Maidens and how to beat the VPremium meta right now. So I hope you like really enjoyed our like a more insightful commentary style. And in any case, that's been us from YellowCard Vanguard, and we will see you next time.